Hey, Rebecca, just letting you know I am back. Um, and great, perfect. Thanks for putting the slides in presenter mode. And you might have addressed this while I was stepped away, but it looks like we have our ASL interpreter on the line as well.
Yeah.
All right. Hey, everyone. This is Megan with the Disability Employment Technical Assistance Center. Amy, I think you were just about to come off mute, so I was going to say I think we have a good group on the line if you're ready to start us off.
Let's rock and roll. That sounds great, Megan. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy Gonzalez. I am the DETAC Senior Advisor, and I am delighted to be here with you today. Session 1, which is our community kickoff, will also be focusing on data, the power of data, and how we can use that data to set employment goals and objectives that lead to measurable outcomes that impact the folks that we are serving in each of our states. I am joined by a wonderful team of people, and we will get to introductions in just a minute. So let's go to the next slide, please, Rebecca. Before we get started, we want to talk about the accessibility that we have during this e-learning community. We all have closed captioning services. For today's session, as you can see, we hope you can see the ASL interpreter. She is pinned. If you require interpretation to participate or any other accommodation in the upcoming sessions, please email aodemploymentta@gmail.com at least 3 days in advance of the next session so that we can take care of that and have that service set up for you come the next meeting on March 12th. Next slide, please. So before we get to introductions, we want to just talk about the agenda really quick so everyone knows what to expect and the structure and content of today's presentation. So we already welcomed you. We have already talked about the accessibility features that we have in this e-learning community. Then we're going to go into introductions for our facilitators. We'll have one today and then a couple of different ones come next session. We're going to provide a brief overview of the e-learning community, structure, some expectations that we have for you as participants, and what you can expect from us as facilitators and experts in the field. We're going to dive into speaker introductions, and then we're going to let ICI take it away and talk about that data, how we can use it, how we can utilize it, take it into consideration, and really embed some of those data information sources and resources in plans. After that, what we are hoping for is a rich Q&A session. And by that, it's being active, right? Either putting yourself on video, getting off mute and engaging in conversations, typing some comments and questions in the chat. We want to hear from you. This is a great group of folks, safe community. And so we're really looking forward to that rich discussion after the presentation. We also have some very brief homework. It isn't anything too labor intensive, anything laborious. It's basically, really looking into the resources, the data sets that we're providing today. And then we just wrap up and remind you when the next session is. So that's the agenda for today. Next slide, please. All right, facilitator introductions. Well, like I said, I'm Amy Gonzalez. I'm the senior advisor to the DETAC, been in the field for over 20 years. And again, it's a pleasure to be here today. I'll turn it over to my colleague, Megan, who will introduce herself.
Thanks so much, Amy. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. My name is Megan Ketchel, and I am the project manager for the Disability Employment TA Center, or DETAC, with the Lewin Group. We're so excited to have you all on the community for DD councils around using data to set employment goals and objectives and measure outcomes. And I will turn it over to my colleague, Rebecca, to introduce herself.
Hello, I am Rebecca from Pong. I'm the project coordinator on DTech for the TASH side, and I am excited to meet you all today, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Next slide, please. All right, so a brief high-level overview of the series is really today we're going to focus on data points, data sources, and how councils can take these points and this information into consideration as you develop your own goals and objective around employment. We understand Data is powerful, but it's important that we know how to use it, how to make those goals and objectives so that we're impactful in our communities. This specific e-learning community was solely open to councils on developmental disabilities, so you are surrounded by your council peers. I'd also like to shout out the NACDD. I believe Cheryl Matney and Amy are also in this meeting today. So we just want to thank you for your partnership and thank you for being here today in this meeting with us. I'm sorry, did somebody want to say something? I think I heard. Okay, then I'll keep going. Really briefly, let's talk about the schedule. So today is our kickoff / data focus. The next session is going to be on March 12th at the same time, 2 to 3:30 Eastern time. And we're really going to reflect on strategies to advance our employment goals and outcomes. And then in the third session on March 26th, same time, 2 to 3:30 Eastern, we are going to focus on planning, on who's involved, who should be at the table when we're planning, when we're developing our plans, our next steps, our timelines, and then we're going to wrap it up. And so this is a very impactful, high impact session because it's 3 sessions where we're really engaging with you, providing resources and strategies to help you move the needle on employment in your state. Next slide, please. Let's talk about ground rules. What you get from the DETAC is a team of amazing, outstanding, brilliant subject matter experts that are well known across the field for advancing competitive integrated employment in their neck of the woods and in their nation. You also have an amazing set of peers with you that understand the challenges with developing goals, understand the challenges with getting, you know, those impact, those outcomes that you really want to produce as you seek to develop your plans. This is also a very safe environment. Yes, the meeting is recorded to send the information to participants later, but we want to encourage people that this is a safe environment that we can talk through real life struggles and support each other to advance in any barriers that we may be experiencing as we develop our goals. And what we expect from you, I think, is really easy peasy in terms of, hey, we want you to be here. We want you to be active. We want to hear from you. We want to know what's working for you, what isn't working, and we're here to support each other and identify manners to not only work together, but help you develop those plans, especially when it comes to employment. We know employment is a huge topic. We know employment is important, and we believe in the potential of the people that we serve. So there's so much power in these plans and in the goals that you set. We also want you to be ready just to talk about it. You can either, you know, get off mute, off video, chat. You can type it in the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with. But we really anticipate an active engagement in this community with any of those manners that you're comfortable with. And as I said earlier, we do have homework, but it's nothing extensive or laborious. So we would appreciate you to look at the homework, you know, look at the resources we send you, and then be prepared come next session to debrief, to talk through that with us, your peers and the experts in the next sessions. Next slide, please. All right. So now we're going to get to introduce our fabulous subject matter expert. Just want to let you know, Dr. Butterworth actually isn't going to be here with us today. He did support Jean in developing this presentation, but he has just welcomed a grandbaby, so he will not be here. So I will be focusing on introducing Dr. Jean Windsor is a senior associate and leads the employment systems and policy team at the Institute for Community Inclusion. She focuses on building the integrated employment system and bridging research to practice through technical assistance to employment systems partners. She is a principal investigator for Access to Integrated Employment, a longitudinal data collection project of national significance. And we're very excited to have Dr. Windsor on board, and everyone knows ICI, the depth and the knowledge that they bring to the table. So we're just delighted to have Dr. Windsor here with us today. Next slide, please. And with that, I will turn it over to Jean. We're looking forward to engaging with you in this session today. Thank you. Take it away, Jean.
Thank you so much, Amy. And I just want to echo Amy's comments earlier. Please don't feel like you need to hold your questions until the very end of the presentation. Feel free to use the chat. There's options to raise your hand in Zoom, and we can make sure to get you a spot, so you don't have to just keep that question burning, but we're able to answer it in real time. And we really do hope that this is more of a discussion than a presentation, because data is only as useful as we feel comfortable with it. And I'm a big believer in the more that we talk about data and the more we understand and unpack data together, the easier it is for us to use, the better we become at using it to talk about the issue of employment and why it is such a key part of helping individuals with IDD obtain economic and other life outcomes that we know are valued parts of our current federal system. So I really welcome your questions, and I'm excited to be here. And just to say, up until about 7 o'clock this morning, John really thought he was going to be here. So we're really excited for him, but know that he wanted to be, he really did want to be here today. Next slide, please. So much of the information I'm going to share today comes from the Access to Integrated Employment Project, which has been funded by the Administration for Community Living since 1988. We are a project, longitudinal data project of national significance. You might be familiar with our sibling projects, the Residential Information Systems Project, as well as State of the States and Developmental Disabilities. We often are featured at national conferences presenting together. And we like to say that we triangulate three of the primary parts of all of our lives, where we live, where we work, and the supports that we have with around us to be able to live the life that we want. So our focus on access to integrated employment is specifically exploring factors that contribute to employment outcomes, and we look at those at both the federal, state, employment provider and the individual with IDD levels. We've spent a considerable period of time over the last 35 years really trying to deeply understand what are the most important parts of our systems that either lead to or impede employment as an outcome for individuals with IDD. And we work really hard to make sure that all of the information that and products that we're developing really are useful. And one of the ways that we do that is we make sure we involve users of our products, including DD Council members, within our advisory committees and other structures that we have for feedback. And there's actually a couple of folks who are on here today who I know have been involved in some of our projects and have provided us that feedback. So I like to take this time to also say thank you for all of the input and feedback that you've given to us over the years, because we really do use that to make our products better and hopefully more richer and more applicable to the field. Next slide, please. So the slide I'm currently showing is the elements of the high-performing employment system. And John and I really always like to start our conversations about employment and data and systems change with this slide. We developed this model in 2007, and it really came about because we were looking at data from our national survey of state intellectual and developmental disabilities agencies, and we were noticing that through the late 1980s, 1990s, peaking in about 2001, nationally, more people were getting an integrated employment service from their state IDD agency. And then in about 2001, we really started to notice a drop off. And that concerned us. I'll be honest with you. We said, why is this happening? And we really wanted to understand in particular why states that were not part of that drop off, but because there was a cadre of about 10 states that continued to increase the percentage and number of folks in integrated employment. And we set about studying those 10 states, through in-depth case studies. Based on those case studies, we developed the Higher Performing States Framework, and it outlines key elements of state agencies, that state ITD agencies that support a high proportion of individuals in integrated employment services. So elements like leadership and values, strategies like that implement policy and goals that prioritize integrated employment, financing and contracting methods within the state Medicaid and state only fund system that prioritize, again, employment, training and technical assistance availability at both the state agency and the provider agency levels, innovative service development, and the primary reason I'm talking with you today, outcome data and other types of data for performance management. And we found that when state IDD agencies brought all of these elements together strategically, and they use that within a framework of strongly collaborating with their state vocational rehabilitation agencies, their state workforce development agencies, and their state Department of Education, that was when they were really able to maximize the number and percentage of people who are having integrated employment services. And so we always like to start there because we know data is a really key part of this, but it really is just one part. And we are always happy to come and talk with you about any of these other parts of the model. So next slide, please. So what do we mean by outcome data? And this is a piece where sometimes we think it should be really clear, and that outcome data, we all think we know what that means, but over the years we've actually found that that's not the case. When we say outcome data, we really mean how many people are working, what wages are they earning, and how many hours per week are they working. And we want to know that information for youth and working age adults with IDD. And we want to understand both at a point in time as well as a longitudinal level what is happening to those numbers, and then how are state agencies and policymakers using that data to change and augment any policies and procedures to really make data-informed decisions. Next slide, please. So data is really important. A lot of times I think we just want to use it to say somebody's doing well or somebody's not doing well. But that's just like the tipping point of what you can, or one way that you can use data. We have really found that states that are effectively using data not only use it to identify what they're doing well, but also use it to identify areas where they need additional work and supports. They're using it to set benchmarks and monitor progress towards state goals. So one of the things that we have been watching for about the past 15 years has been the number of states that have employment first policies. And one of the first things that we're always looking at when a state has an employment first policy is, did they set any goals or benchmarks for how they're going to move employment forwards? How would they know if that policy is a success? And so that's a really key piece that we are always focused on and really wanting to help states talk through. Additionally, I mentioned data is so useful to be able to understand where you're not doing well, and to help states to target their capacity building efforts. So one of the things that sometimes states will see is, wow, we've gotten more people working, and that's really exciting. but they notice that the number of hours that somebody works per week is or in an aggregate or on an individual level is stagnant. And that's a really interesting question to try to unpack. Why don't we see more people working more hours? And I think data allows us a neutral entry point and to be able to have that discussion. And then lastly, we see some states that have data that goes all the way down to a provider level that they make available to the public. And we have found that that's a really useful component to supporting job seekers to be able to make an informed decision about the supported employment provider that they want to receive services from. A lot of times, in the past, that hasn't always been possible for people to do. They go on a trusted recommendation from a case manager or from a friend in the community who's used a similar provider, but they don't necessarily have other concrete pieces of information to help them make the decision about who to choose. And so that's really a key thing that data can help us to do. And all of that boils down to not only increasing participation, but also improving the quality of the employment outcomes that we see within a state. Next slide, please. So when we talk about employment, we mean competitive integrated employment as defined within the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. A lot of times, again, we think when we say a job in the community that we all mean the same thing. We have found over time that that's not the case. And in some circumstances, there's a little bit of a slippery slope in people wanting to really encourage and support any type of job that appears to be located in the community and labeling that as competitive integrated employment. But we know that that's not the case and might not meet that federal definition and expectation. So when we say competitive integrated employment, we truly mean an individual job that you or I could go out and apply for, the same as anybody else. The job can happen with or without paid supports or natural supports. We would be earning the same wages and have the same benefits and opportunities as our peers without disabilities who also hold a similar job type. And really, that's what we think about. That's what we all, when we envision applying for a job, we're all thinking about applying for a competitive integrated job in the community. And that really is the gold standard. Other types of jobs that are considered integrated are group supported employment, but that does not meet the standard of competitive integrated employment. And in some states, we've seen a growth of businesses that are provider owned that primarily hire people with disabilities, but yet interact regularly with the public. That is not going to meet the standard of competitive integrated employment. And then lastly, I think the one that we're all very familiar with and we know would not meet that standard is facility-based, sheltered workshop-based employment or 14C sub-minimum wage employment, that does not reflect the tenets of competitive integrated employment. And that's not what we're looking for when we talk about employment generally. Next slide, please. So there are several different data sources to consider when we talk about where do we find or collect data on employment for individuals. One is state agencies, particularly our state IDD agencies, but also our state vocational rehabilitation agencies, in some circumstances, our state education departments. We also can look at national data that's collected nationally. So specifically things that are collected across all individuals, regardless whether they have a disability or not. So that would be the American Community Survey data, Bureau of Labor Statistics data. Those are important sources of general employment trend data. And then the last two, individual level and provider level data. Those are typically pieces of information that a state agency intentionally develops strategies and implements expectations for the collection of that data. And so when we say individual level data, we truly mean that the state is reaching out and has a mechanism to collect information on every individual who they provide a funded service to about the individual status in integrated employment. And that the state, if they choose to, ensures that that is collected, or excuse me, that that is connected to the provider who's offering services to that individual, because it's not just necessarily about what's happening at the individual level, but also what's happening at our provider level. And that those are two equally important pieces of information. One of the things that we often see in states where we do technical assistance with providers is that they'll, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this yourself, that there'll be multiple providers in one region, and you'll see really different outcomes from different providers. And a lot of times you'll have one or two providers that are saying, well, we can't do any more. And then when they start to see data from their peers that are, within a 10-mile radius, that really challenges them to think differently. So I'm sorry, was there a question? Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. And so again, there's different ways to even look at each of those sources of data. So one is outcome data, and that's what I mentioned at the very start of this presentation. Are you working? Where are you working? How many hours a week are you working? And what wages are you earning? That is the most concise pieces of outcome data that we can collect. Other types of data that we collect through some national surveys are specifically related to service participation. So are you in a service a paid service that supports integrated employment? Are you in a paid service that supports day habilitation? And so that's what we mean by service participation data. And then the other two pieces are related to when we collect data. For a lot of states, they choose to collect data, particularly if they're looking at individual outcome data, at one point in time every year. So maybe they do it for everybody in the month of April, or maybe they say we're going to collect information on every individual at the point of renewal of their individual service plan. So that's one way of looking at the data. States that have collected point in time data for several years are then able to move forwards and be able to use that data to understand long-term trends within their system and to be able to really reflect back and see, are the changes and expectations that we are instituting in our state, are they leading to the outcomes that we want to see in people's lives? Next slide, please. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time going through some and providing some examples of data from national level data sources. John and I decided to start with this because this is information that is available publicly. It's available to all of you. Much of it through our ThinkWorks state data website, again, which is funded by our Access to Integrated Employment project through the Administration on Community Living. And so we're going to talk about data from the American Community Survey, which is very broad and encompasses everyone who participates in the census every 10 years. And then the American Community Survey is those 9 years in between where they're collecting a sample of individuals across every state. Data from the Social Security Administration, which is, we're going to look at Social Security or supplemental security income recipients. And then we're going to talk a little bit about vocational rehabilitation services, 9/11 data, services and outcomes, our ICI data that we collect, our National Survey of State IDD agencies, and then we also partner with Human Services Research Institute and the National Association of State Directors of Developmental Disability Services to access and use their national core indicators data. And then lastly, we always have taken a look at the Department of Labor 14C certificates. We have chosen to only show and display national level data today, in part because we wanted to really make that our focus. We didn't want to point out any states. If you in the data have any questions, or you kind of want to know, like, well, where does my state fall on this? I'm more than happy to have a conversation after the fact, offline with you. But we really wanted to keep this high level and knew that not every state would be represented. So if there were questions about a state, we wouldn't want to answer on their behalf. Next slide, please. So this is just a different representation of what you can gather from each of the different data sets, particularly the length of time that it's capturing, the level of information that you're able to discern, the type of data, and then the target population. Next slide, please. So if you've seen me present before, you might have seen this slide or this infographic from our state data website. It comes from data from the American Community Survey, and the most recent data that we have available for this is from calendar year 2022. I love this slide because to me it is about why we care about employment. Employment is how we make sure that we're not living in poverty. It is a significant part of our American culture and how we interact with one another. So I really like to point out that when we look at people without a disability, almost 77% are working pretty regularly. And that's a long-term trend line. And that because of that, just about 10% of people without a disability live in poverty. But then when we start to move back, and these are, I'll just say, diagnostic categories that the American Community Survey has developed and that they specifically ask individuals about. And that's, I think, a really important just piece to understand. You can look at a bunch of different types of disability. We, in particular, at ICI, look at the cognitive disability category. That encompasses individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but also other groups who meet that diagnostic and functional criteria. And I would encourage you can find that information publicly on the American Community Survey website, but also I'm always happy to talk more about that and how those diagnostic categories break down. But when we look at that for people with cognitive disabilities, we see most people, less than half of folks with a cognitive disability are working. And we see almost 30% of people are living in poverty. And that to me is such a strong connection about why employment matters, why we really want to help people to be who they want to be, work the jobs that they want to work, so that they can really live the life that they want to live. So next slide. So this data comes from the Social Security Administration. I mentioned it's the percentage of supplemental security income recipients who work. I mentioned we didn't call out states, but you can see that it ranges from a low of about 2.89% in states to a high of about 12% in states. And I think that really, that variability is so important to focus on, because a lot of times we kind of get mired in the low numbers or really focused on, oh gosh, like that's so low, it seems insurmountable. But then when I look at the right-hand side of the slide and I see states that are doing demonstratively better, it really makes me ask questions such as, well, why are they doing better? And what can we learn from them? So that's another just piece I think that's so important on how to look at that. So
Hey, Jean, we have a question. Do you have an example of how and from whom a state gathers individual level data and ensures that it is relatively accurate? Thanks, Rachel, for that question.
I do, and I'm going to get to that towards the end of the presentation. I think it's about slide 39. So if you can hold on till then, I will definitely be able to answer that question.
Sounds good. So hang tight, Rachel. Thanks, Jean.
Okay. So next slide, please. So this slide again comes from the Social Security Administration data. And for those of you who've been in this field for a while, I think one of the things that many of us saw in the early 2000s was a lot of excitement about the use of different types of work incentives, Social Security Administration work incentives. And we really saw those start to climb. There was so much emphasis at the federal and state level on supporting people to use impairment-related work expenses or IRWEs, PASS plans, and we seem to hit sort of a high point a little over 20 years ago. And nationally, these numbers have declined pretty significantly and consistently since then. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. But I think it's just important to know and understand that we really, when we took some of the emphasis off of using these, ensuring widespread knowledge about how to use them, and ensuring that we had a sufficient number of people who were trained and how to effectively implement these and support individuals, that we saw a significant decline nationally. And excuse me, if you were to go to our state data website and look at our Blue Book appendices, or to take a look at our Build-A-Chart features, you can look at this on a state-by-state basis. And sometimes when we do that with states, they're just blown away because there can be less than 10 people in many states who are now using these types of benefits. Next slide, please. Excuse me. I should preface this by saying I live in a very cold climate, and so my heat is on all the time, and so I'm still a little bit dry, so I apologize. This next slide comes from the ICI's National Survey of State IDD Agencies, and it's looking at the number and excuse me, percentage in integrated employment services. And this data goes back to 1988. There's a couple of really important pieces here that I like to point out. One of which, this has been a cumulative slide. So if you look in 1990, there's a little more than 300,000 people nationally receiving an employment or day service from their state IDD agency. Shortly before 2020, that number peaked over 600,000. We saw a little bit of a dip, and now we're seeing that number increase again. In 2022, it was almost back up to 600,000 individuals receiving a day or employment service. We've also seen a very slow increase since about 2013 in the number of individuals in integrated employment services. And currently, the percentage in 2022 is the highest it has been in 20 years. It was 23.5% as the national average, which was wonderful. There are, however, again, a cadre of states that are well above that. one that is well over 80%, but there's a significant group of folks that are in the 30, 40, 50, 60%. And I really encourage you to, if you're on state data, if you're looking at those, take a look at who those states are. Take a look at where your state is in relationship to the national average. One of the really exciting pieces that I have found, and I think we've all suspected this, not just from looking at the 14C data, but from other pieces that we acts that have happened at the state level, education that our self-advocates have engaged in, and that I know many of you as councils have engaged in related to 14C, some minimum wage. And we have seen, even before the home and community-based settings implementation in 2014, that the number of people in facility-based work was starting to go down. And now that has gone down. And if you could see a little bit differently, I think we might have it in the next slide, but the number of people in integrated employment services is now higher than the number of people in facility-based work services nationally. And I just think that's such a great reason to stand up and cheer, because it really shows that while this work is hard, it takes a lot of continued effort and consistent effort. When we do it and we put in that consistency and we put in that effort, we see real results, and the people that are part of our system see those real results. So I think that's such an important piece. The one thing that we aren't 100% sure on is why we've also seen so many people in non-work services, and those non-work services are both happening in the facility and in the community. We talk with states about that all the time. We talk about with their service definitions. We talk with them to understand what are the expectations and outcomes of their non-work services. Is there something there that's making them more attractive to individuals and to families and to providers? Is there something that's happening where, because more people are working in jobs in the community, they're accessing non-work services for the points in time when they're not working to wrap around them? We think it's a combination of things, but I think it's something to think about, and how is that playing out in your state? Next slide, please.
Quick question from Juanita. We got a couple more questions and I'm excited. Juanita is asking, could it be, Jean, because we are just getting better at keeping numbers and keeping the data? Do you think that's a reason?
So I will say our data comes from state Medicaid authority data. So it's service data. So I always hope that that data was always well accounted for. But I also do think, Juanita, there is something to the fact that we have more sophisticated management information systems now, and that is also a component of it. So I don't like to say it's one thing or the other, but I think it's that combination of pieces.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Jean. We have one more question. Jennifer wants to know, where are these non-work services happening? Is it in facilities? Where exactly is this taking place?
It's happening in both facilities and in community, and in the community. One of the things that I would just say, there are very few states that have non-work service definitions that support individualized community non-work wraparound services. So even when a non-work service is happening in the community, it's still often happening in a group setting. It's not individualized the way in which you and I want to live our lives, right? We want to, you may not get to choose who you're with that day. You may not have even gotten to choose the community activity that you're doing. So we know that there's a lot of unpacking, one, that needs to happen with that data still. as well as quality improvement. And I'll just, I'll point to my former ICI colleague, but now a colleague at the University of New Hampshire, Jennifer Selesky, who has done considerable work related to community life engagement services. And we continue, even though Jen's not at ICI anymore, we continue to partner with her on several studies related to better understanding when we do community non-work services, well, what does that look like? Hopefully that, and I'm always happy to talk more offline. So.
Thank you so much. You're free to keep going.
No, these are great. And yes, it's happening in day habilitation programs. That is, that is still happening more than I think anybody really wants to think about. I know when states have different capacity and abilities to do those types of monitoring visits. That is a piece that we hope as states continue to implement the HCBS settings rule. We know that compliance was really just the floor, not the ceiling, I like to say, and we really hope that that's a piece that continuously is brought up and that is states are engaged with. So I'm going to just move back to this slide and talk a little bit more about our integrated employment service data. Again, I mentioned that national average is 23.5%, but this is the range of states' participation. And I said, you know, there's some states that it's really, really low, but there's some states that are really, really high. And I think it's so important to understand what those states are doing. The other piece that I always like to point out is that just because a state is below the national average or that they're just around the national average doesn't mean that there's a lack of effort, doesn't mean that there's a lack of even progress. And that's why it's so important, one, to look at these pieces longitudinally, but two, to understand, are there, and dig a little bit deeper, are there pieces that are happening that are sustained, that are focused around improving employment outcomes and services for folks with IDD in your state IDD agencies? So next slide. This one, I won't lie, often gives a lot of us heartburn at ICI. But sometimes people come to us and they really want us to say, okay, tell us from your data, what's the right amount of money per person that should be spent on integrated employment services? And if we spend more money as a state, are we going to have better outcomes? I intentionally included this slide, not because I wanted to give you all heartburn, but I wanted you to really have a moment to think and understand that financing is just one part of this. And so we see states that are doing really well in integrated employment who spend considerably less than others. So that's the red line. Per person on integrated employment services. We see states that spend a lot of money that are doing okay. They're a little bit higher than the national average, a little bit lower than the national average. And then we see a whole bunch of different variation. And I always like to just point this out because a lot of times we get caught up in conversations about payment rates. We get caught up in conversations about service types just for integrated employment alone. And I always like to just take a moment and step back and say, the money for integrated employment is important. It should be something that you are paying attention to. But the flip side of this is understanding how much money per person is spent on those other services that are not employment. How much money is spent in pre-vocational services? How much money is spent on those non-work services?
We have a question. Does this data reflect and include Medicaid provided supported employment in CIE?
Okay, just Medicaid is a service code in the HCBS taxonomy. It's not competitive integrated employment, it's supported employment. So I just want to make that clear. But yes, this data includes any Medicaid waiver that is funded or monitored by the state IDD agency. So as long as it includes individuals with IDD within that waiver. It's not going to, this isn't representative of maybe like a brain injury waiver that wouldn't come under the purview of the state IDD agency.
Thank you. Oh, hold on. Question from Sue. Hey, Sue. Does the data track self-employment?
So that is a state by state piece. Most states are not able to break that out, and it often is not able to be broken out of their Medicaid data. But I'm gonna, when I get to about slide 39, we can talk more about that. Because there are states that track this, so.
Okay, great. And then just one more question, because, you know, this is getting juicy. Do you have this data by individual state? I think you mentioned that. So, you know, states can, you know, view a comparison, kind of know where they are with respect to everyone else across the country.
Absolutely. So you can, and there's some links to this later in the slide deck, but you can find that on ThinkWorks, our ThinkWorks State Data website, where you can access that information through both our Blue Book, which is our national annual report, as well as through our Build a Chart feature. And you can select and build a chart comparison states that you want to look at. The other piece I will note, we're going to get to the end here. You're going to see a whole list of a cast of characters who are the faces behind this work. And actually all of their names are hyperlinked, and all of those folks are willing and able to help with custom data requests or help support states to, as you're developing your plan, sort some of this out and be able to give things maybe in a little bit more of a succinct way than you having to sort through it yourself. So. Okay, so next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier our partnership with the National Association of State Directors of Developmental Disability Services and Human Services Research Institute that cooperatively manage and implement the National Core Indicators Project. Not every state every year participates in NCI, but there are a significant number of states who do, and that number has grown significantly over the past 10 years. And I think that's really a testament to the National Core Indicators Project and the work that they do. They look at data from a sample of individuals in states that choose to participate in a given year. And they're running from their survey runs from July through the end of June. So that is the fiscal year component that they're on. We look at their data because it lets us dig down a little bit deeper into what are people doing on a day-to-day basis. And so we wanted to really understand what was happening immediately before 2020, and then what was happening immediately after, as we've moved into the past couple of years in recovery. And how has that changed how people are spending their time during the day? And so, unfortunately, you know, we did see a decline in people in individual jobs, as well as other different types of work, including facility-based work. But we also saw a decline in people's participation in unpaid community activities and unpaid facility-based activities. And one of the things that we really think has happened there is that I mentioned the trend that we saw before in 2019, about over 600,000 people being served in employment and day services nationally. And we saw that drop off pretty significantly during the period between March of 2020 through March of 2023. And that's really the period that we're looking at here. We still have not seen that recovery that we had wanted to see. So, and then there's a question there. in the chat.
Yes, there is. How do you define facility-based work? Let's talk about that.
That is a great question. So we define it one way in our survey, and NCI defines it a little bit differently in their survey, but they're similar enough. So facility-based work is sub-minimum wage employment, sheltered employment. We include pre-vocational services in our service definition because by the HCBS definition of pre-vocational services, people are not working. They're on a trajectory towards employment in the community. And so that's, yes, and thank you for including the NCI definition. But we're similar. They're a little bit more functional. We're a little bit more focused on overall understanding from a programmatic perspective on how a state IDD agency might respond. And part of that is really just because we're asking two different groups of people. NCI is asking individuals, their families, and reviewing their individual case notes for this information. We're asking for the data on an aggregate basis from state IDD agency staff members. So I'm going to move to the next slide. I want to make sure I do get through everything. This is our last piece from National Core Indicators. And again, this to me is so powerful. 83% of people are not working in an individual job in their community. When NCI breaks that down and says, if you're not working, do you want to work? 43% of those who are not working are saying they want a job. And then they look a little bit further, NCI does, and they say, okay, does that person who wants a job who's not working, do they have a job in their service plan? Only 37% of folks who don't have a job and want one have a plan in their service plan to get a job. We're not doing a very good job of listening to people. If you look at some of the really great research articles that have come out recently from HSRI, one came out just this summer in particular, and it literally demonstrated that if an individual has a goal for employment in their service plan, they are more likely to get a job. So they've done the math, it's there. That is a key piece. We are just not doing a good job of listening to people. We need to figure out how to do that better. So next slide.
Question. Were you able to collect data related to the 2020-2023 years, the extent to which the job market changed, COVID times?
So that is a very state dependent question. I would say for a state that had an individual data collection system and knew the type of jobs and industries that folks were working in, they would be able to talk about that. But more globally, no, because the population of folks with IDD becomes so confined within these larger national data sets that it's really challenging to make any meaningful conclusions about that, just because the ends are so small. We do know when we look at Bureau of Labor Statistics data that through at least February of 2023, that people with disabilities had faster recovery in the job market, but they're not able to necessarily tie that to specific job types. So, and then this last one is really, I mentioned, we've seen the number of approved and pending 14C certificates decline dramatically over the last 10 years. And I just hold that up again as something that is a really positive piece and demonstrates the education that has gone on and people's greater understanding of why those practices were important in the past, but they're part of our past, and we're moving now towards our future. So next slide.
Another question. Oh, no, this is a comment, I think. NCI is great for outcomes, but there are limitations in how reflective the sample is of all surface users in the state. Each state uses their own sampling frame. Most states randomly sample from specific waiver programs, but some states exclude specific populations. Any reaction to that? or comment about that?
My reaction would be that definitely have that conversation with folks at HSRI. But I would say that if you have more questions about that, you're not quite sure where to start about reaching out, they do have some really strong information about their sampling technique that they provide publicly in their method section. But I also know Dorothy Hairsteiner, and I'm sure that she would welcome outreach from you to be able to talk to you and answer your questions. So
Caitlin, let us know if you want us to help with that connection. Thanks, Jean.
no problem. So I'm going to go through these next couple of slides on the RSA 911 data a little bit quickly. Really, this is a trend that shows that the number of closures into integrated employment for folks with an intellectual disability has varied over the last 10 years, but it ultimately has declined. And that's a really interesting piece that is very much tied not to any piece of federal legislation, but really so much to our local VR systems capacity. And so I think it's important as you look at your own state's data, that that's a piece that you're talking about within your state and that you're cognizant of, because I think that's a really just key piece to understand. We don't have enough rehab counselors in many states. We don't have enough providers in many states. And I think, this is a reflection of that. Next slide, please. And then we see that even though the number of closures into employment declined, the percentage has been pretty stable. And that's also a reflection of who's getting services. So if somebody is getting a service, at least it's pretty consistent that they're having a closure into employment. But that we have seen that, again, that capacity piece has gotten lower. Next slide, please. And then that variation. So the percentage of all vocational rehabilitation closures in a state that the individual has a diagnostic code of an intellectual disability. And very similarly to the IDD survey data, that range is pretty significant. And so again, you can look at this information on a state-by-state basis from the state data.info or ThinkWorks/state data website. And so next slide. So I wanted to show you, because I've mentioned it a couple of times, what the state data website looks like. So this is actually the top of the website page, and then the next slide is actually the bottom. But what's wonderful about this is similar to our sibling projects, RISP and State of the States, we all display 5 key questions on our home pages that you can answer from our data sets. And so you're able to go and access that information. We're currently actually updating that with 2022 data. All of our data is lag data just because of how it's collected in aggregate from states. Items number 2 and 3 on the right side of your page are just really pointing out the links to our Blue Book as well as our Build a Chart feature on the website. And again, all of those pieces we're happy to have secondary conversations with you about. We use a lot of this information to help states who are sort of like, wow, this is a lot. We're not sure what to pull. This is the point that we want to try to emphasize or the education that we want to try to pull. Can you help us understand what the most impactful data points are? And we're really happy to do that. Next slide, please. And so this is the bottom of the page where we highlight our state data Blue Book, our Build a Chart feature, and then our state snapshots, which are 1-pagers where you're able to look at the most recent IDD survey data for your state, compare it to the national average, and the same if your state participates in national core indicators. You're able to see a breakdown of your state's data and then how that relates to the national average. So next slide, please. So I think we've covered this, but I think this is this is why you're all here. You're really trying to dig deeper on why and how to use data on employment. And I mentioned earlier, it's about establishing goals and benchmarks at the state, provider, and individual levels. And I don't mean like, targeting an individual and like watching their trajectory, but really saying at the individual level, what are the changes that we want to see in the outcomes that individuals experience? We know that it's a really key part of implementing whether the impact of your state's employment first laws and policies. And then one of the things that we just want you to think about is, does your state have other service outcome goals that are important to measure? Does your state have a policy or priority about sheltered employment and 14C employment? Does your state have any priorities related to non-work services? And are you thinking about the way in which employment and non-work services may or may not interact in your state when you have a goal for employment first, but you don't seem to be reaching it? So next slide, please. And then, what are the data sources that your state's currently using to measure success? And we know that this really varies by state. It varies by sometimes administration, year to year, executive branches changes in states, and sometimes some of these pieces start to fall off a little bit. But what is it that your state is using and your council is using really to think about measuring your employment success? The two, really low-hanging fruit ones are the ones that are available nationally and publicly. So the agency level data from the RIDD survey, National Core Indicators, and RSA 9/11 provide a nice triangulation. I don't ever say one data set answers all your questions. I wish I could, but provides a nice triangulation of different pieces that are happening within your state and how they interact with one another. And then there's the general employment trend data from the American Community Survey and Social Security Administration. And then there's the individual level and the provider level data, which is really a piece that when we talk to states is something that they have decided intentionally that they're going to collect and intentionally that they're going to use. So next slide, please. And I will give you a full disclosure. This is John's favorite slide. If you've not heard of a BHAG, it means it's short for Big, Hairy, Audacious Goal. And John always for the last 20 years, has encouraged me to think really big. And what's my BHAG? I will tell you my BHAG is that we see folks with IDD participating in the labor market to the same extent as people without disabilities. So I really challenge you all to think about what's your big, hairy, audacious goal, because if we don't put it out there, we don't talk about it, we're never going to see it, to see that realization happening. And so next slide. And then John always likes to know, examples of those BHAGs. I mean, John F. Kennedy said, we're going to put a man on the moon and bring him home safely. Paul Wayman in October of 2023 in the State of the Science Conference publicly said maybe our BHAG should be 50% of people employed at least 25 hours a week by 2040. Nobody's made a national decision. I haven't necessarily seen a state level decision, but I think it's really important to go back and talk within your council, to talk within your board members. What goals do you have? What's the vision that you have? And what are the metrics that you are going to use and encourage within your state to be able to make that happen? So next slide. And then why are BHAGs important? Because they unify us and they push us forwards. And the whole concept of this comes from Jim Collins and Jerry Porras in their book, Built to Last. So if you're looking for the source of that, definitely go on to your favorite bookseller website. Maybe it's an independent bookstore, maybe it's a big conglomerate, but ask about Built to Last with those authors and encourage you to check it out. So next slide. So again, I think we've talked about this, but I'm always happy to talk about it more in different settings. When you're thinking about creating your state plan goals for employment, consider, are you looking at data that is process oriented and has process goals, like more people getting an integrated employment service? That's an important goal, because if more people are getting an integrated employment service, it's hard to also track, are more people getting employment and getting an employment outcome. And I think both of those are equally important. They just serve different purposes. And these are two examples of an individual or of a process goal and an outcome goal on the slide. And so next slide, please. Other outcome metrics to consider. I always say, please keep it simple. The more you ask, and the more data that you try to collect, the sloppier the data is going to get. And if your goal is accurate data, fewer metrics are always better because it's easier to ensure that there's accuracy. So things like the number of adults who are employed, the number of new jobs that have been obtained in the last year. Those are things that are pretty concrete, that allow you, that are still pretty contained. Next slide, please. And I think this is slide 39. So I was right. I wasn't just guessing previously. So we wanted to highlight one state's approach to individual employment outcome data collection. Next slide. And this example comes from the state of Maryland. Full disclosure, we are contracted to the state of Maryland and a couple of other states to support them to collect this type of data, and then we provide the analysis and the data display. Maryland has been reporting this for many years. You can actually access this website and all of this information publicly through our ThinkWorks State Data website. There's an actual drop down for individual employment outcome data collection. This is just one of the types of pieces that Maryland, or excuse me, ways that we display data for Maryland. And you can see where it's broken down by the type of employment activity. And somebody had asked earlier about self-employment. Is that counted? Maryland does count that. There is also a piece here where they're differentiating individual competitive job from individual contracted job. If you think about Maryland and where they're located, they have a lot of Ability One contracts. And so they didn't want to exclude those from this, but they also wanted to make sure that it was identified differently than an individual competitive job. And the same with their group integrated employment. You can see that they break it down and they collect additional information, again, about the average hours worked, and the way in which that allows them to then have conversations about what are people doing when they're not working is a really important part of their success. There's some, I think many of you might be familiar with Karen Lee in Maryland, and she's such a strong provider, and there's a very strong provider community in Maryland that is looking and doing this. And I think there's a question.
Yeah, what is group integrated employment? How is that defined?
It would be the equivalent of group supported employment. They consider it an integrated job because it is not happening in a provider owned facility. We can parse, and I love those conversations offline about what does that really mean. And that's, to me, again, goes back to the very beginning of this presentation about why that focus on individual competitive employment is so important. I think breaking those things out allows Maryland to see that there's 232 people that they want to help move into an individual job. And I think so, and I think that that's really important to be able to have those conversations. So, but yes. Next slide. Enclaves would be another word, yes. So just wanted to give you some additional resources on ThinkWork. We have a 15-year plus grouping of state agency and provider agency promising practices. We also have best practices in the use of performance measurement and data, some examples for that. And then I've mentioned this previously, the Blue Book, the state snapshots, and the build report, the build a chart that's available on state data from our state data website. Next slide. And then I mentioned there's a whole bunch of people who aren't here today, but wanted to draw attention. You know, John is retired. He still works about 8 to 12 hours a week. So we gently and with much respect call him our data guru emeritus, because he really is somebody who has brought data and the use of data in employment for people with IDD to the forefront for well over 20 years. Other colleagues are Daria Doman, Alberto Migliore, John Shepard, Ryan Wedeking, Allison White, and Agnes Zaleska. And they all have various roles and are experts in different data sets that I shared with you today. So do not hesitate to reach out. We love to talk about these things. And I'll stop there. Amy, I think I did it.
You nailed it, Jean. Thank you so much. I think it's been very informative for everyone on this call today. We got a quick question from Mike. Hey, Mike, glad you're here today. It says, kudos to Maryland and ICI for collecting this information. Was there an increase in employment outcomes from the previous year?
Yeah, so Maryland has been collecting this information for about 10 years now. And over time, they have seen a steady increase in the number of people working. And they know that that's due to not just collecting data, but some other policy changes and service definition changes that they've made. They also have a very significant investment in provider training and technical assistance. And that really is linked to their data collection because they're able to look at this information. I wasn't able to show that to you, but on a regional basis within the state and then a provider by provider level snapshot within the state to be able to target some of those more appropriate case or capacity building pieces that those providers might need to change their business practices.
Okay, great. And so next question, do you recommend similar outcome measures for provider level programs?
So yes, I absolutely do. I would say I think providers can do this on their own. And we've seen providers that take the initiative to do that and to engage in use data to support their organizational transformation process. So I think these measures are absolutely valid at the provider level as well. I always like to see it be a little bit bigger, though, than just a provider deciding to do that themselves or a pilot with providers to see them doing that themselves.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, I got one in my inbox. We have some council members that support segregated employment. They are pushing us to include goals to keep people with disabilities in segregated environments or even encourage youth to transition post high school. How should we approach this challenge? We want to work with our members and partners to get a consensus for integrated employment. Any ideas there? Any suggestions there?
That's a really big question. I would say if that was your question, definitely, because I don't know who that question directly came from, to reach out, I would be really happy to have a larger offline conversation with you about that. But it is, I will agree, it is a challenge. And I think part of that goes back to the very beginning of the presentation, what is the reason that we want to see people working, and what does competitive integrated employment bring to their lives that's different than a sheltered employment situation or a sub-minimum wage situation. I do think a lot of this is not just about data and a conversation is something right or is something wrong, but really about trying to understand what is the value, why are people still valuing those outdated places and models that we had. And I think when we start to peel those pieces back, particularly when we engage in conversations with individuals and families that maybe were part of those early days of those programs in the 1980s and really put their blood, sweat, tears, social capital to raise funds on the line. And now we're saying that's not something we want to be supporting anymore. There's a lot of emotions there that are, I think, really important to acknowledge. And that has nothing to do with data and everything to do with helping people move to something different. And that's a really yeah, it's a challenging piece. And I would just say that your state is not alone, that there are so many places that even where there's a lot of success, those conversations are still happening. This is hard work, and it's hard.
All right, thanks, Jean. Are we getting somebody maybe that's just unmuted and has a question they'd like to ask verbally? I'm just gonna pause for a minute because I thought I heard someone. I'm just gonna give it like maybe a few, like 10 more seconds. Oh, Cheryl says the DETAC definition on employment could be helpful. Good suggestion, Cheryl. Okay, so another question. We've been presented with many resources, many data points to consider. What are some recommendations of maybe some first steps around these data? Is there maybe a suggestion of a certain set of data to review first, or a certain process that you recommend? Because I'm sure, at least from this question, that some folks might be overwhelmed and unsure where to start and how to look at this data.
Absolutely. So I would start looking at your state snapshot profile on the ThinkWorks State Data website. It's going to give you the total number of individuals receiving services, the total number of individuals participating in an integrated employment service, the percent in the integrated employment services, the total dollars, as well as the percentage of those dollars that are spent on integrated employment. And it's going to let you really quickly compare what's happening in your state to what happened that year nationally. And so if you want something really quick to digest, that would be the place to start. And again, I'm so happy to have secondary conversations with anyone, whether they're here or you go back and talk with folks at your council. They're like, we want to know more, but you're not. Definitely reach out because this is hard to try to parcel. But I think those to me are the key ones if you're just starting to look at this.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Good tips. All right, then let's give it a minute or so, see if anybody wants to unmute and use their voice. All right, we got another question in the chat. Thanks, Beth. Is there data after employment, like length of time on the job, community living, things like that?
So that is very much individualized data. And that's when it becomes so much more important for this data to be collected on a state level. So outcome data to be collected on a state level basis on a person by person. And one of the things that we know is a lot of this stuff is really like embedded in people's individual service plans. And there's not really a way, one, for it to be looked at in an aggregate cross state level, but also that it's really hard if you're just looking at one person's service plan. You're really only just seeing one service plan. And so it's really challenging to see that. So that's a point in time where it's so important to be able to work with your state agency that has all of that information to really better understand what's the data that they have access to, and then how are they using it. There are states out there that have really robust management information systems and are doing these types of things. Washington State is always a strong example, but I would also point to places like Ohio, where internally they're using that data as a state. and by internally, I mean to the state IDD agency. It's not necessarily always all public information, particularly if it starts to get to a point where you might be able to identify somebody in their community. But there's definitely places where they're looking at that and trying to refine that more clearly.
Okay, great. And one additional question, we understand there are so many wonderful resources for folks to look at. They have maybe some ideas of what's next steps to take, but is there any recommended partners that you suggest, aside from maybe council members, that should be at the table when they're taking into consideration all this wonderful data? Any partners you recommend, Jean?
So I always recommend partnering with your self-advocacy organization, whether it's a statewide organization or it's, ones that are more individually based in your communities. I think that is such an important group of people to have at the table and having a lead voice in those conversations. I also think connecting with your parent organizations, particularly your youth-based parent organizations, because oftentimes parents don't know what they don't know until they get to 18 to 22. So the earlier that you can help start bridging partnerships, having a dissemination partner for those youth and individuals in elementary and even early intervention, I think those are some key pieces that should always be at the table. And then I think earlier there was a comment about engaging with your University Center of Excellence in Developmental Disabilities as another partner. Your protection and advocacy organization can be another key part, and really any of the DD network or DDAC network partners, I think, really should be invited to the table. And if they're not ready to be invited to the table yet, keep inviting them back. I think that's also a really important part of this.
Thank you. Okay, I think I saw that Jennifer raised her hand. Please feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the presentation, all this data today. It's so useful. And we're excited to reflect on it and think about ways in which we can collect data better in Massachusetts. Some of the things that I see that are real barriers, and I'd be interested in other states who have made more advanced gains around competitive integrative employment. We see obviously Social Security can be a disincentive because people are afraid to work too many hours and then lose their essential Medicaid supports or services. And then in some states where there are very well-organized vendors and providers who really primarily offer day habilitation programs, who have close connections with legislative leaders, I have observed in some states that they receive a lot of funding for those services, but you're not hearing a lot of advocacy around the types of services that you were talking about today. So I'm curious, for states who have achieved more impressive employment goals, how did you get around the disincentive policy issue with Social Security? And then, what are you doing in your state to help level the playing field in terms of how lawmakers decide to allocate service dollars so that there are more services available for folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities? And the other thing I'll mention too, that's a barrier, is that I know of at least 2 states that I've worked in over the last 10 years that their VR programs view people with more significant intellectual and developmental disabilities as too disabled, and then they refer them back to like their developmental services entity in the state and don't offer competitive integrative employment services to those folks. So, we're having to overcome a lot of things, but I'm really interested in knowing how states have made great gains despite those challenges.
So I'll just say, and you said you're in Massachusetts, right? So Massachusetts actually does have an individual employment outcome data collection system very similar to Maryland's. And it's actually, you can access it from the same point on ThinkWorks state data. So I definitely that is actually a ping in my ear, and I appreciate it because it says to me that that's not getting that information isn't actually getting out to folks in the state who might want to use that information. The other piece I would just say, like, and Massachusetts is a little bit of an anomaly where dehabilitation is considered a state plan Medicaid service and not part of the HCBS, and that's a challenge. And working with legislators who are seeing that as a viable piece. One thing we have seen states do is increase the number of hours of respite services that are available, because a lot of times we find that dehabilitation services become a proxy really for the need for respite, particularly for individuals who still have family members that they live with who are needing to work, and that there's a perception that they need that level of supervision. The other pieces that we're seeing more of is states that are embracing technology first in conjunction with employment first, and thinking about how to break apart this perceived either or, that you're either supervised by somebody or you're completely on your own, and the role that technology can play there, that you're either working or you're not working in a non-work service, and that we're seeing states try to have a better strategy to support people to have more of a whole life, but that it can be challenging when you get down to the case manager and the service provider level to make that happen.
Great.
Well, thank you so much for the answer to that. And I need to find the link. I don't know if someone can drop it in the chat. I need to check that out for Massachusetts, because I was at a Massability webinar a couple of weeks ago, and I asked about what services do you offer individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, around competitive integrative employment. And they're like, what's that? So then I put in the chat the link to the DOL website for competitive employment, and they had indicated that for those people, we usually refer them over to developmental services. So I can't wait to check out the website.
Yeah, and that's not an uncommon problem in states, unfortunately, and that's a whole other webinar.
Rebecca, let's move to the homework slide, please. So thanks so much, Jean. This was an amazing presentation. It's obvious that there's a lot of need around this. And like I mentioned at the beginning, we were going to assign some homework. And really all we want you to do is just review some of the wonderful data sources that were provided to you today during this e-learning community session. We're probably doing this already, but really start reflecting on those employment goals or objectives that you want to set, that you set in your last plan, that you want to set in your new plan, and just come ready on the next session, which is March 12th, to share, to ask questions, and to be pumped for our next speakers from Rhode Island and Washington, D.C. councils. Next slide, please. So we're looking forward to seeing you on March the 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern time. In the meantime, if you have any requests for accommodations or any additional questions, please reach out to us at aodemploymentta@gmail.com. Next slide, please. We'd like to thank everyone for being here today. And again, thank Jean. And please feel free to reach out with any questions. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you on May 12th. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.